The Vietnamese in their daily lives have certainly gotten past the Vietnam War, which they call, by the way, the American War. But there are still signs that they haven't fully forgiven the nation that was their mortal enemy. This is the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. It used to be called the Museum of American War Crimes. Outside, displays of American aircraft and tanks left behind when the U.S. bailed out. But inside, there is a big, prominent display dedicated to Agent Orange. There are lots of photographs of people with disabilities and deformities they blame on the herbicide, as well as photos showing how the U.S. used it. But you don't have to come to this museum to find out what Vietnam deems the dreadful, enduring effects of dioxin.
You can't read a newspaper in Vietnam over the course of 3 or 4 days without seeing at least one article on Agent Orange.
In Hanoi, we met the American ambassador to Vietnam, Michael Mahalik. He acknowledges that Agent Orange is a lingering ghost from the war. There are Vietnamese, including people in government, who say the United States is not doing nearly enough when it comes to Agent Orange, its impact on the environment, its impact on human life. When they present you with that argument, what do you say?
Well, I simply talk to them about the fact that we've been working with the government for a long time on this issue. It's an issue that is very sensitive. It's an issue that needs to be addressed by both sides.
I'm going to interrupt. Why is it sensitive? It was the United States that brought Agent Orange to this country. It was the United States that sprayed it in this country. So why is it
Well,
sensitive?
there are many people who have some very emotional views on this, and as a diplomat and as an American who did not participate in the war, I try to keep the emotion out of it. And so people immediately start getting emotional and saying, you have to do this and you have to do that. And what I say is, you know, let's take a look at the facts. Let's try and find out exactly what it is we're talking about here, and then let's see what is the best way forward for both of our countries.
What the U.S. wants to know is, can anyone say for sure that these unlucky young Vietnamese, so many years after the war, are victims of Agent Orange? Since there could be many causes of disabilities and diseases like these, what the U.S. wants is proof.
We still don't have accurate scientific data about exactly what the health effects are of dioxin and how it affects things and what the causes are. So let's make sure that we know exactly what it is we're talking about here. And that's very difficult to do in this area where a lot of the science is still somewhat new.
Is someone naive or ill-informed if they say, look, it's obvious, people who live in these regions that were contaminated where the Agent Orange was used suffer a higher rate of disabilities and deformities and so forth, cancers?
Well, no, I don't want to classify people as naive or not, but I mean, it's kind of a too easy connection, let's put it that way.
And it's true. The connection is not incontestable. There are other possible explanations for many of the maladies we saw all over the country.
If you look at the environmental situation in Vietnam and some of the chemicals that are put into the water, and into the air, and into the soil here, I think that you can come very quickly to the conclusion that, well, maybe there's not just dioxin to worry about. There could be a lot of other things here. And again, with the healthcare system, prenatal care, postnatal care, very rudimentary here. And a lot of the villagers lead a very hard life, and so there are all kinds of potential causes for various types of illnesses or birth defects or disabilities. So, yeah, I would be very careful of drawing too quick a conclusion here.
But some Americans working on this issue of Agent Orange have not just drawn quick conclusions. We went to Washington to see Walter Isaacson, president of the Aspen Institute and co-chairman of a group called the U.S.-Vietnam Dialogue on Agent Orange Dioxin. When I interviewed the ambassador, his response was, we need more science. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like we need more science?
Mm-hmm. When you walk around Vietnam in the areas where it was sprayed, or even in areas nearby, you see a higher incidence of birth defects and cancers. And a lot of studies have shown that. You can't find the pure, exact numerical correlation, but in our hearts as well as in our minds, we know that this increased the number of birth defects and cancers.
Dr. Phuong from the hospital ward in Ho Chi Minh City is part of Isaacson's U.S.-Vietnam Dialogue group. You know, the United States government says there's not enough science.
Yeah.
You laugh.
Yes. Yeah.
Why do you laugh?
Because they know they have enough proofs that dioxin can cause many kinds of illnesses and defects. So that if they still say, no, not enough sciences, not enough scientific proof, it means a pretext to deny something.
There are some areas, though, where the science is not in dispute, where both sides agree on what the problem is and how it should be fixed. We are the first Western journalists ever allowed by Vietnam's government to see what was America's biggest air base up close. This is what you might call Ground Zero, Da Nang Air Base, from which American planes launched on their missions to defoliate the jungle. Now, the spraying may have taken its human toll, but there's also evidence of heavy concentrations that were and still are right here, because this is where, right on this site, where 55-gallon drums of Agent Orange were mixed and loaded, stored, and of course cleaned out after the missions. Over the years, between leaking barrels and wind and rain and natural runoff, tests show to this day some of that dioxin is still in local groundwater.
In the former airbase, especially Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and Phu Cat, the level of dioxin are high and very high.
How high? A Canadian environmental firm tested the soil here, and the results were startling. They found dioxin levels at 300 to 400 times the international standard for what's considered acceptable. One scientist who took part said if these places existed in the United States, they would require, quote, immediate cleanup. One was this sickly plot of land where nothing productive ever grows. I don't know if there's contamination in this soil, but tests have shown that there is. And there's water all around us. Today's kind of a rainy day, and maybe some of it is runoff, but that's precisely the problem. So we'll turn the camera over here, and you will see there's water that goes into the field, and from the field, who knows where. When we left the tarmac at Ground Zero, our Army escorts led us to two locations nearby that demonstrate the insidious migration of Agent Orange, which infiltrates anything from soil to animal fat and stays for generations. When it rains, these must get higher and overflow.
When it is full, it overflows into the river and lake.
The other spot they took us on our tour around the edge of the airbase was Lotus Lake. The astonishing thing about Lotus Lake, the shocking thing, is that until only a couple of years ago, locals still came to fish here and took that potentially contaminated fish home for the evening meal. Now, at least there's a guard tower manned by soldiers to warn people off if they still show up with a fishing pole or a net. And the United States, 35 years now after pulling out of Vietnam, can take some credit. Although the U.S. already gives aid to Vietnam, last year Washington finally dedicated dollars to directly target dioxin. It is a relatively small start, since the total cost of cleanup in Vietnam is put as high as $60 million, but still, the U.S. did appropriate $3 million, in part to help clean up the dioxin at the airbase. Also, thanks to the Ford Foundation and others, barriers have been built and cement caps installed to keep the dioxin from leaching further into the groundwater and food supply on which people depend. This is critical, because that Canadian study also showed that rainwater has carried dioxin into the drains of the city.
There's a lake there, and a lot of people were actually still fishing in the lake and whatnot. We've now kind of closed that off, and we're working closely with the government of Vietnam on the actual remediation. How do you get rid of the stuff that's in the soil?
Yeah, closing it off and cleaning it up are two different things.
Correct. But you got to do one first, and then you can get to the other.